This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 63, Alex Radita, part 2. In last week's episode, I told you the tragic story of 15-year-old Alex Radita, who succumbed on May 7, 2013, to an infection caused by untreated diabetes and starvation at the hands of his parents. Alex's death was essentially long-term medical neglect and torture by his parents, Emil and Rodica Radita, Romanian immigrants who evidently believed that God, not medicine, would heal their son. Despite multiple interventions from British Columbia's Child Welfare Agency, the Raditas were able to elude continued supervision by moving to Calgary, Alberta, where Alex ultimately died weighing 37 pounds and covered in necrotizing sores. In this episode, I'll tell you about the murder trial of Emil and Rodica Radita, the mountain of testimony against them, and the verdict. I'll also talk about the aftermath of Alex's death and the effect it had on the people who tried to save him, discuss the sorry state of child welfare systems all over the world, and remember Alex as the bright, creative boy he was. This is part 2 of the horrific story of Alex Radita. My sources this week were the same as last week: Global News, the Mayo Clinic, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, HuffPost Canada, Medicine Hat News, the Calgary Sun, CBC News, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, The Telegram, Cochrane Today, CTV News, News 95.7, National Post columnist Christy Blatchford, The Calgary Herald, CFJC Today, Correctional Service Canada, and the Crime Beat podcast episode entitled The Boy Who Fell Through the Cracks. If you haven't yet listened to episode 62, which was part 1 of Alex's story, I recommend listening to that one first. Since I neglected to mention this last week, I want to give a quick shout out to Lisa C., who suggested I look into Alex's case. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'd also like to give a few shout outs to my newest patrons: Kelly from Mayfield, Utah, Maureen from Rochester, New York, Kelly from Springfield, Illinois, Lisa from Calgary, Alberta, and Alyssa from Roy, Utah. Thanks so much for all of your support. As I mentioned last week, I switched from my previous patron program to Patreon a couple of weeks ago, so I'd like to thank the patrons who continued to make the switch with me, including Desiree M., Amy C., Jennifer M., and Kaylee M. Thank you for your continued support. If you were formerly a supporter on the Podbean patron site, you'll notice I closed it down last week. If you'd like to continue supporting me, or if you'd like to make a new pledge, you can visit www.patreon.com/stlcpod, where each pledge level receives rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive show merch to bonus content. Because I just started with this program, I haven't yet released any of the bonus content, but I'm hoping by the time this episode is released, I'll be just about ready to drop my first Patreon exclusive bonus minisode. With that, I'm going to jump right back into Alex's story where I left off last week. Buckle up, because some of the testimony heard at his parents' murder trial was graphic and disturbing. The Raditas trial began in May of 2016 before Alberta Court of Queen's Bench Justice Karen Horner and was scheduled to last 5 weeks. Emil and Rodica were originally set to be tried by both a judge and a jury, but they chose, prior to the trial's commencement, to be tried by the judge alone. For most of the multiple weeks of testimony, the gallery was all but empty, scattered with a handful of reporters and very few others. At the beginning of the trial, a process called voir dire took place, which is kind of like a mini trial within a trial, to determine the admissibility of what came to be known as the BC evidence, including Alex's various hospitalizations for diabetes and his removal from his parents' care in 2003, among other details. The evidence, which was essential in proving a pattern of intentionally neglectful behavior on the part of Alex's parents, was ultimately admitted. During opening statements, Crown attorneys alleged then 59-year-old Emil and 53-year-old Rodica killed Alex intentionally by denying him treatment for his diabetes. They said Alex was confined to his room where he died a painful, lonely death. He was isolated from leaving the home or seeing anyone outside the home to hide his condition. Prosecutors Susan Pepper and Marta Juzwiak called a large number of witnesses over the subsequent weeks. On Wednesday, May 25, 2016, the court heard testimony from Dr. Danielle Picot, a pediatric endocrinologist called to testify as an expert in childhood diabetes. After reviewing documents and photos from Alex's case, Dr. Picot testified the child was in a severe state of malnutrition, saying Alex seemed to not have been provided with the proper care for his diabetes. Testimony from paramedic Deborah Bombach, who was first to arrive at the Raditas' home on the evening of May 7, 2013, painted a starkly horrifying picture of Alex's final moments. There was nothing left of him. The jawbone on the left side had an open sore. It was so deep it looked like you could actually see the jawbone sticking through. Ms. Bombach testified that Emil told her that evening that Alex was diagnosed with diabetes a month earlier and was on 2 types of insulin. Another witness called to testify early in the trial was Constable Larry Puglisi, who was the first police officer on the scene after Emil's 911 call. Constable Puglisi testified he was told by medical investigator Shauna Mitchell that there was literally no way Alex was alive when his father called 911. Her assessment was 12 to 36 hours he'd been deceased. A paramedic told Corporal Puglisi that Alex was beyond hope, and the corporal testified, "When I looked at the boy, my first instinct, he's dead. It was like a skeleton." When investigators asked the reason for the delay in calling for medical assistance, Emil and Rodica told them it was Alex's choice to wait. Corporal Puglisi testified, "Emil had said that he told Alex he needed to go to the hospital, but he refused and said that he didn't like to go to hospitals because he had a bad experience when he was 3 years old." Constable Puglisi and Investigator Mitchell took the parents aside into a bedroom to discuss Alex's death, at which time, Puglisi testified, Rodica told them Alex had no medical issues or chronic health problems. The constable, who had been informed about Alex's diagnosis of diabetes when he arrived at the home, told the courtroom, "That's when I spoke up." Rodica then admitted that Alex had been diagnosed when he was about 3, and although she did not believe the diagnosis, she gave him insulin anyway. She and Emil told the investigators that Alex had the flu for about 3 days prior to his death and had suffered from diarrhea for about a month. Medical investigator Shauna Mitchell also testified, saying there were multiple people praying when she arrived at the Radita house. The parents told first responders Alex was breathing when they checked on him around 6 p.m. They didn't call 911 until 10 p.m. On June 2nd, the court heard the testimony of Dr. Jeffrey Gofton, the forensic pathologist who performed Alex's autopsy. Dr. Gofton testified that Alex was subjected to neglect and starvation, describing Alex as having a skeletal appearance, thin hair, and sunken eyes. The 15-year-old boy was wearing a diaper and was severely underweight with next to no body fat. He was in the 0.1 percentile for 15-year-olds based on height and weight. Even an extremely thin teenager, Dr. Gofton testified, should have about 1 centimeter of fat on his abdomen. That abdominal fat helps fight off illness and infection. Alex had between 1 and 2 millimeters, which is about the thickness of 1 to 2 dimes. In this condition, Alex would have been unable to fight the infection in his body, Dr. Gofton testified. It would be overwhelming for him. The pathologist told the court that Alex's teeth had rotted to stumps, and it did not appear there had been any dental intervention. Alex's body was covered with 44 ulcers from the bridge of his nose to the bottom of his feet. Many of them were pressure sores or bed sores, which are ulcers that develop when a person sits or lies in one position for too long. Some of the lesions had healed, but most hadn't. The one on Alex's neck was the worst, Dr. Gofton testified. It was black and so deep that Alex's salivary glands were exposed. I saw tissues in the neck showing extensive tissue necrosis and near liquefaction, which means the tissues have just gone to liquid. It means the usual structures that are present of the neck muscles are no longer present. This wound was the most likely entry point for the bacteria that ultimately killed Alex. Dr. Gofton said, "There's no indication that Alexandru has been to a hospital in Alberta or received ongoing regular follow-up treatment for his disease. The neck wound in itself is an emergency. When that appears, that needs a medical, if not surgical, treatment." As for the time Alex died, Dr. Gofton testified, it was difficult to determine exactly. The official time of death was listed at 10:16 on May 7, 2013, which was when paramedics examined him in the home, but it was possible Alex had died as early as 24 hours prior to his father's 911 call. On Friday, June 3, 2016, members of the Radita family's church testified before the court, saying there was nothing in their religion that prohibited being treated by a doctor. They also testified that they were told by Emil that Alex had cancer, and they told the court about being told on May 7, 2013, that Alex had died the night before and been resurrected that morning. One church member, Romanian native Marius Siltan, testified that Emil had told him they believed doctors in BC had caused Alex's diabetes by giving him insulin, which was why they never took him for medical treatment. He testified, "He recorded on DVDs how doctors abused the child, and after that they decided to don't let the doctors to treat the child, and they treated at home." Marius said after hearing about Alex's supposed resurrection, he visited the Radita home during the day, where Rodica and Alex's 7 siblings were praying in the living room. "I asked what's happened, and they said the child was dead and now he's alive, but we will still have to pray because he's weak and God has to make strong body. I start to pray. We pray for about 1 hour. After praying, I asked Rodica if I can see the boy, Alex, because I want to see him, how he is. He was looking very bad. I was shocked." After seeing Alex, Marius took 3 of Alex's sisters to their Romanian Apostolic Church to testify how God worked with our brother. At the church, the oldest sister, Janina, spoke before the congregation. She asked the church to pray for her brother. She said that last night her brother died and God resurrected him. After Janina's speech, Marius testified, some of the churchgoers flocked to the Radita home. "We made more prayer, and after that, the elders, they go to the bedroom to see the child. The old people see the boy, and one elder asked Rodica, 'Sister, it's alive?' She said yes." That was when the pastor suggested calling 911, which Emil finally did around 10 p.m. When prosecutor Marta Jezwiak asked Marius if members of their church obtained medical attention when they were unwell, the witness replied, "Yes, all the people." On Monday, June 6, 2016, the court heard the testimony of pediatric endocrinologist Dr. Laura Stewart, who said that when Alex was diagnosed in 2000 with type 1 diabetes, the Raditas did not want to give their son insulin. Alex, she testified, tested in the severe range for diabetic ketoacidosis, which can cause muscle aches, nausea, fruity-smelling breath, vomiting, and even organ failure. He responded well to treatment, but because of his parents' unwillingness to accept the diagnosis, they were not allowed to take him home until they demonstrated they were capable of administering their son's insulin and checking his blood sugar. "What I remember is the mother still not accepting the diagnosis of diabetes and initially did not want to learn how to manage it. Eventually she did comply on how to get the child home, but never did acknowledge the diagnosis." The next day, the court heard testimony from Dr. Daniel Metzger, a pediatric endocrinologist from the BC Children's Hospital, who also treated Alex after his initial diagnosis with diabetes in 2000. Dr. Metzger said the couple refused to believe their son had diabetes and that Child and Family Services had to pressure them to treat his condition before he could be allowed to go home with them. "The major thing that I remember is the initial resistance, that I was wrong about the diagnosis of diabetes, that we hadn't done the right tests, that we were still not correct with the diagnosis." In 2001, Dr. Metzger testified, it was discovered that Emil and Rodica were apparently testing their own blood sugar and calling those readings into the hospital. He knew this from looking at the blood sugar meter. "At one point, the blood sugars were very consistently the same. I've been doing this for 23 years. We have a lot of teenagers who fabricate blood sugars. You start to recognize patterns. I concluded that somebody was probably falsifying the blood sugars, perhaps doing their own finger pokes, because you have to put a sample on the meter to get a reading." In his opinion, Dr. Metzger said, the results being submitted as Alex's readings were those of a non-diabetic person. Dr. Metzger documented his concerns to share with the BC Ministry of Children and Family Development. Shortly afterward, Alex was transferred from BC Children's Hospital to a hospital in Surrey, closer to his family's home. Metzger did, however, see Alex twice a year until 2008. While in foster care, the doctor said, Alex gained weight and seemed to thrive. After Alex was a no-show for a scheduled appointment in July of 2008 and another 6 months later, his office contacted Children's Services. "Anybody who misses 2 visits, we would get concerned. Obviously, this is a high-risk situation, and so we needed the ministry to try and find him for us. We did as many inquiries as we could do and checked provincial dispensing records. At that point, it had been a year since the parents had bought insulin in British Columbia. We called the school, and they hadn't seen him in a long time." The family, of course, did not tell Dr. Metzger that in 2008 they had moved out of BC altogether, fleeing to Alberta to avoid the intervention of child welfare professionals. On June 8, 2016, Jana Wong, a social worker who informed Emil and Rodica of Alex's diabetes diagnosis in 2000, testified, saying, "Mrs. Radita told me that her son didn't have diabetes. She thought that he had an infection and just with some rest and food, he would be fine. I was a little bit concerned because I thought this denial was a little bit beyond the norm. Subsequently, Ms. Wong testified a home care nurse was assigned to check up on the family for a longer period of time than was normally allowed. She was aware that Alex was admitted to the hospital again in 2003, severely malnourished. I remember one of the doctors describing him as looking like a poster boy for the children for Africa when they have those big bellies because he looked so ill. When she heard Alex was ultimately returned to his family, the social worker said, she kept in contact with caseworkers involved in his case because she was so concerned. Visits with the family were not going well. They said that food was an issue and the mother was using food as power in the relationship. Another witness on the stand the same day was former RCMP Corporal Beck, who interviewed the little boy while he was in foster care. Corporal Beck testified about visiting Alex in the hospital in Surrey, BC, in October of 2003, telling the court the experience was something she would never forget. Struggling against tears, Ms. Beck said, Alexandra was lying in a hospital bed. At that point of time in my career, I had never seen a child in that state. He was so skinny. He couldn't lift his head. He couldn't lift his arms, couldn't lift his legs. He was a skeleton. He talked in very, very quiet whispers and only a few words at a time, and you had to literally put your ear to his mouth to hear him. It was the worst state that I've seen, physically, a child that wasn't actually deceased. She next saw Alex while he was in foster care in June of 2004. Had I not been there to see it for my own eyes, I would never have believed it that it was the same child. Chubby, happy, non-stop talkative, couldn't sit down in a chair for more than 2 seconds at a time. On June 9, 2016, Dr. Michael Sear, an expert in malnutrition and its effects on the human body, testified. He treated Alex when he was hospitalized in BC when Alex was diagnosed, and again when he nearly died from lack of treatment. We tiptoed around this boy. I thought there was a fair chance he would die. Once Alex's condition began to improve, Dr. Sear testified, I told the mother that her child had diabetes, that he was stable, he was turning the corner, and she told me he does not have diabetes. In October of 2003, Dr. Sear said, Alex would have died within a day if he hadn't been brought to the hospital. Dr. Sear said he had never seen malnutrition to that extent in Canada. On the witness stand, while looking at photos of Alex from his 2003 hospitalization, the doctor paused, sighed, and mumbled in disbelief. Dr. Sear was also asked to analyze Alex's condition in photos taken on January 29, 2013, at his 15th birthday party. He said Alex was severely malnourished and approaching the final stages of malnutrition. He's trying to put on a brave face. This is not a happy child. He's very, very miserable. The doctor also looked at photos of Alex taken after the paramedics arrived on the day of his death. In the photos, Alex wore a t-shirt, a diaper, and a soiled bandage on one leg. There are only tendons and bones. There's nothing left. He testified it would have taken months for Alex to reach that state. Alex's bedroom appeared filthy, according to Dr. Sear, who said, To call this neglect, you need a new word. This is utter neglect with this emaciated corpse in the middle of it. On June 12th, the prosecution called to the stand a BC social worker named Richard Gage, who told the court he had been threatened by Emil Radita not to come within sniper range of the family's home. He said he'd been a former member of the Romanian Special Forces, and I was waging psychological warfare. During his testimony, Mr. Gage was asked to describe Alex and became visibly emotional, saying, We liked Alex. You just saw him and took an instant liking to him. A polite little boy. In an interview outside the courtroom, Mr. Gage, who was no longer a social worker, told CBC News he learned of Alex's death when he received a phone call from a police detective in Calgary. I was in the car with my wife and saw this message on my phone and heard it was from the city police service. I cried when they told me he died. Another social worker, Ravinder Dami, was assigned to track down the family after they failed to show up for scheduled doctor's appointments in 2008 and 2009. Under cross-examination, Ms. Dami told defense attorney Jim Lutz that during her search, she was given an address in Calgary for the Radita family, but she did not notify social services in Alberta, saying, It's not a part of our procedure. Another prosecution witness was Dr. Robert White, a pediatrician who was called to examine Alex at Surrey General Hospital in BC in December of 2000, after an emergency room physician suspected the sick little boy suffered from diabetes. Dr. White said Rodica was convinced the diagnosis was incorrect and was not shy about saying so repeatedly. She continued to express concern that the diagnosis was made by the doctor jumping to a conclusion, and she was very uncomfortable with that. When Alex was being transferred to BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver, Dr. White said, Rodica made a very strange statement to him. He didn't have diabetes, and she was going to prove the doctors wrong and made reference to God in our conversation. She and God were going to prove us wrong. She was going to prove the doctors wrong, and God was going to make him better. Dr. White was again called to care for Alex when, 2 years later, he was readmitted to Surrey General, severely malnourished and close to death. He was so ill-looking that the pediatrician on call was uncomfortable providing the resuscitative care that was necessary. He was so sick when he came in that time that I was taken aback myself. The mother was with him, and so I chose not to engage in a big discussion with the mother because I was a little emotional at the time. Dr. White testified that Radica said she had changed Alex's medication and stopped giving him the long-acting insulin. This is quite a drastic alteration in the care she had taken of her own volition. The justification was he got a rash. One memory, Dr. White said, still disturbed him. Radica said she was trying to get food and insulin into her son prior to their arrival at the hospital, and after his admission, doctors had to remove a chunk of undigested and unchewed wiener from his esophagus. He obviously was not very conscious. This next detail took me by surprise, but after the prosecution finished calling witnesses, the court recessed for summer break. With all the video conferencing and virtual meetings going on these days, we all want to look our best. If you're like me, you're probably confused by all the different methods of teeth whitening on the market. Now that I'm partnering with Smile Brilliant, I've learned a few things that you might find helpful about home teeth whitening methods. For example, LED lights are a novelty item. Whitening strips neglect the gum lines, crevices, and molars. Charcoal is abrasive and wears down your enamel. And whitening toothpaste only works on surface stains. So if none of these miracle products really works, what does? The number one product recommended by dentists is the custom-fitted tray, which usually costs an arm and a leg because they require a dentist to make them by hand using a model of your teeth. With Smile Brilliant's Lab Direct process, you can get custom-fitted teeth whitening trays at a fraction of the price without a single visit to the dentist. Using an exact model of your teeth, Smile Brilliant's lab technicians will handcraft your trays to give you the best possible whitening results. All you have to do is visit smilebrilliant.com, and when you order their system, make sure you use the coupon code CHILDREN at checkout for 30% off. When you receive the package from Smile Brilliant, it's really simple. You just make your dental impressions at home and return them using the prepaid envelope they provide you. In a matter of 1 week, Smile Brilliant will have your trays back in the mail. Using my coupon code, CHILDREN, means you're supporting me while saving a huge amount of money. So check out smilebrilliant.com today. When the trial resumed on Tuesday, September 13, 2016, one of Alex's sisters took the witness stand. The girl's name and age were protected by a publication ban, so all we know for sure is that she was a minor when she testified. Because prosecutor Susan Pepper told Justice Horner that the girl was deeply traumatized since her brother's death, her view of her parents was blocked by a giant screen, and they could only see her on a video monitor. It was said that during her testimony, Emil and Rodica occasionally smiled, and Emil reportedly lit up when he watched and heard the videos of his children playing and laughing in the family van. Rodica's lawyer, Andrea Sarink, apparently showed the family's videos and photos in an attempt to impress upon the jury that the Raditas were normal, loving parents. One of the videos shown in court was recorded in the van by the witness herself after a family trip from the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta. During the video, the girl sang and made animal noises as she recorded her siblings. During her cross-examination, Crown Attorney Marta Juzwiak got the girl to agree that her parents didn't believe in doctors because of religion, and that none of their children were taken to see a doctor when they were sick or injured. When she dislocated her knee on a trampoline, the girl said, her mother massaged it back into place. She shrugged, admitting that maybe that wasn't the best way to treat such an injury. When Alex was sick, she testified, her parents would treat him with holistic remedies. They would give him tea and herbs. In that vein, the girl testified that as Alex became sicker in his final months, his parents never took him for medical treatment. She told the court there was always plenty of food in the home, but Alex refused to eat. We tried to feed him, but he would deny it. Wearing a hooded sweatshirt, the girl stood to watch the video of Alex's birthday. In that video, some of Alex's siblings surrounded him as he opened his cards and presents with weak, fumbling fingers. Alex's siblings squealed with delight as the birthday boy removed a brown teddy bear from a gift bag, and one cooed, "Oh, a puppy," when he opened his birthday card. The girl testified that her brother's mood at the party may have been a little down, probably because he was not feeling the best. She said he was sort of sick at the time. When asked what he was sick from, she replied, "Like the daily sickness," explaining she meant, when you had a cough or a sore back or something, I don't know. Watching her brother on the video, politely thanking his siblings for his birthday presents, the girl finally broke down, sobbing, at which time Justice Horner called for a break. The girl was the only witness called by the defense. Neither Emil nor Rodica Radita took the stand. Closing arguments began on Wednesday, September 14, 2016, with the defense. Andrea Sering said the Crown had not shown evidence that Alex's death was murder. At best, there was evidence suggesting culpable homicide, manslaughter, or criminal negligence. The defendants had admitted that maybe they had mismanaged Alex's conditions, but they were adamant they did not murder their son. To prove first-degree murder, Sering said, the Crown had to prove the death was planned and deliberate. To prove second-degree murder, prosecutors would still have to prove it was within the realm of common sense that the defendant's actions would result in death. In order to find the Raditas guilty of murder, you need to be convinced they intended to cause his death. You have to be satisfied the only conclusion is these individuals intended to have Alex die, or intended to put him in circumstances that they knew would result in his death. You would essentially have to infer that the Raditas are so malicious they purposely planned and wanted to witness a slow and deliberate death for their son. Sering mentioned there was evidence his parents tried to treat Alex with home remedies, and there was evidence they loved and cared about their son. Testimony from experts and doctors throughout the trial, Sering said, had proven Alex's parents didn't understand how to manage his condition. She said they didn't understand how to manage diabetes, whether that be because of a complete misunderstanding in terms of incompetence or stupidity, or just plain not wanting to learn. I can't say I've ever heard a defense attorney blatantly call her own client stupid using that very word. It seems to me that the opinions of all of the Crown's expert witnesses were that the Raditas were willfully ignorant regarding Alex's diabetes, as if it would go away if they ignored it. Stupidity and ignorance is no defense. Andrea Sering herself used the phrase common sense, which means most people would understand Alex was in mortal danger, even if the court was to believe the defendants didn't because of their own possible stupidity. The following day, the prosecution, represented by Susan Pepper, gave its closing arguments. The Crown respectfully submits that it has proven all of the elements of first-degree murder in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Of Emil and Rodica, she said, they failed to provide regular insulin injections, regular nutrition, regular medical care, and critical medical care to Alexandru. The risk to Alexandru's life caused by this neglect was entirely foreseeable. He was as dependent as an infant in the end, with no one in the world outside of his family. His parents were the sole keepers of his life, and they withheld that life by denying him insulin, food, and medical care. At some point, the accused knew that their plan was killing their son, or they knew that he was likely to die, and they accepted this consequence. They knew this, and yet continued their plan. For the accused to be able to execute their plan, they had to evade the scrutiny of doctors and school officials who might stand in the way of their plan. Both watched as his body blistered from the horrifying effects of starvation. As Rodica stubbornly shook her head at the defense table, Ms. Pepper told the courtroom, Rodica continued to express an egotistical attachment to her own position. She cared more about being right than about the truth. Alex was an isolated child. He had no resources outside his family. He knew no one. Alex could no more live without insulin than he could live without a heart. He was doomed and trapped by the two people with the power to save him. What little life he was allowed in the end was marked by pain, by sickness, and by a profound loneliness that must come from knowing the world is not for you. Justice Horner's decision wouldn't come for several months. At long last, on February 24, 2017, Emil and Rodica Radita were convicted of the murder of their 15-year-old son. In her decision, Justice Horner agreed with the prosecution, saying Alex was kept in purposeful isolation by his parents, who were fully aware of his diabetes and how it should have been treated. Mr. and Mrs. Radita intended to and did isolate Alex from anyone who could intervene or monitor his insulin treatment aside from themselves. Alex died as a result of bacterial sepsis brought on by extreme starvation. His physical condition at death was not a sudden or quick occurrence, but rather took place over months, and probably, years. The evidence underscores that the Raditas were well aware how ill Alex was and still refused to treat his medical condition with proper insulin protocol and medical care. They knew he was dying. Your actions in starving your son Alex to death are beyond comprehension. You persisted in arrogant confidence. You persisted until he was dead. Alex's very painful death was unnecessary and completely avoidable. Prior to sentencing the convicted couple, Justice Horner offered them a chance to address the court, but Emil and Rodica, who sat emotionless and stoic through the hearing, both declined. Each received the mandatory sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Prosecutor Susan Pepper told reporters after the sentencing,
The facts that Justice Horner found were such that you really did see the magnitude of Alex's suffering, how how long it was and how extensive it was. And this verdict reflects the magnitude of that suffering and reflects the magnitude of the crime that was committed.
Ms. Pepper continued, I think that there are probably, unfortunately, children in the same situation as Alex Radita. It would be naive to think that there are not other children who are being isolated by their parents so those parents can abuse and or neglect them. As good as our system is, it should be better. That should not happen. If this case could lead to anything, it would be a meaningful discussion about how to fix things and how to make change for other children who are living in conditions that may not lead to homicide, but who are suffering. The fact that there was no one in court to speak about the impact of Alex's death except for a social worker who dealt with him 8 years prior spoke volumes. It really highlights the degree of isolation that Alex lived in. He had no friends, or teachers, or support people, or doctors, or anyone.
If change could occur from this, that would be a really fitting legacy for Alex.
Social worker Patricia McDonald, who fought to remove Alex from his parents' custody in 2004, said after the verdict,
Alex was a very brave and a very smart little man, and he would have wanted for his life to have had meaning. He would have wanted for it to have brought about change for other children. And so I'd be asking for an Alex alert, like there's an Amber alert, but we need an Alex alert to honor him and for him to have a legacy. I have contacted my MP and hope to work towards that direction and would really invite anybody else to join me. I'm happy with the verdict. I think that it really is justice for Alex. He went through a horrendous, horrible ending to his life, and I'm glad to see his parents being held accountable.
Days after testifying at the trial in June, Ms. McDonald spoke to CBC News about learning of Judge Gary Cohen's decision to return Alex to his parents in 2004. I had to hold on to the bench in front of me, and I just said under my breath, he's just sentenced Alex to death. Patricia now suffers from PTSD, and as of 2016, she had been unable to work for 2 years. Her interview with CBC News was the first time she spoke publicly about Alex's story. We, including myself, tried our very hardest to protect Alex, to keep him alive. I think for us, the ministry, we were failed by the court system. I had never come across, in my whole career, parents that were so difficult, so resistant, so angry, hostile as the Raditas. How could he not get it? It's astounding. How could he have made that order given all of that evidence? Patricia wrote a victim impact statement that she was not allowed to read in court because she was deemed too far removed from Alex's case to be considered a victim. Because it wasn't heard when and where it was intended, I'll share at least part of Patricia's statement with you now. I have been attempting to write this victim statement since testifying at your murder trial, Alex. However, I would like it to be an action statement as opposed to a victim statement. Victim implies helpless, and indeed, Alex, you were helpless in the hands of your parents. However, how you faced this horrific circumstance was brave and heroic. You showed such strength in the worst of circumstances, seeing your frail, skeletal body, and yet, after all you have been through, forcing a misplaced smile on your very unhappy face. Those eyes that I remembered having a twinkle, a spark of light, looked dull and sad, the eyes of someone grieving. Indeed, you were grieving the loss of your own self. I find it difficult to understand why you had to suffer so. I do believe, Alex, you as a child were sent to this earth with a clear purpose. You were diagnosed at age 3 to parents who would never accept that diagnosis. You suffered. Oh, how you suffered. I like to remember my visits with you at your foster mother's home. We were both so proud of you and how well you understood your diabetes. Your foster parents encouraged independence and had a range of food you could choose from. Alex, you were so engaging when you attended appointments at the Children's Diabetes Center. All the staff were delighted to see you. However, these positive memories are shrouded by the torment that you must have experienced through all those years that followed. Alex, I feel you would have been aware, as you were wise beyond your years. Remember when I took you for your interview at that Surrey RCMP station, and you said you only wanted to return home if your parents had learned to manage your diabetes? Alex, we need to honor your short life by developing a Canada-wide alert system, similar to the Amber Alert. We need an Alex Alert. Alex's life is so well known by his death, but what I feel he would want for his life is to protect other children from experiencing a similar fate. He would want his life to be a legacy for safety and well-being of all children. 2 years after Emil and Rodica Radita were sentenced, in February of 2019, a 3-member Alberta Court of Appeal panel upheld the Raditas' murder convictions, rejecting arguments that the two should have been convicted of manslaughter instead of murder. The panel said Justice Horner was not mistaken when she ruled the Raditas intended to commit murder when they neglected Alex to death. Since their son died while confined, the panel ruled, they were indeed guilty of first-degree murder. In the ruling, the panel wrote, "While there was no evidence that the appellants put restraints on Alex, they had absolute control over what Alex ate, who he saw, whether he attended school, and what, if any, medical care he received. Alex was extremely vulnerable. The appellants deprived him of education, deprived him of medical treatment, and deprived him of interactions with people who would recognize his plight. The father went so far as to tell his pastor that Alex was suffering from cancer. The appellants exercised complete control over him. Instead of considering only the bacterial sepsis, the trial judge properly considered that it was starvation that led to the sepsis. The uncontested medical evidence was that sepsis, neglect, and starvation go hand in hand." A year later, in February of 2020, a higher court still, the Supreme Court of Canada, declined to hear the Raditas' appeal. Emil, now 64, and Rodica, now 58, are currently in prison in Canada, but because the specific location of inmates is considered personal information under Canada's Privacy Act, it is unknown where they are serving their sentences. One of the lingering questions from Alex's case is, how could this happen? BC's representative for Children and Youth, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, told CBC News, "The importance of child welfare requires not just child welfare investigators, but everyone connected to the life of that child. Everyone needs to take some responsibility when children are obviously sick, invisible, and being maltreated. But when a child moves outside of the province, unfortunately, as happened in this case, they completely fall off the radar." Ms. Turpel-Lafond, who was at the time a judge on leave from the Saskatchewan Provincial Court, decried the lack of cooperation in notifications between provincial social service agencies. "Our child welfare systems are very outdated. They've been under a lot of strain and observation, and offices like myself have reported very clearly that these interprovincial protocols don't work. We've had no national leadership on child welfare in Canada for a long time. It's overdue." In a letter to the BC Ministry of Children and Family Development, which is headquartered in Vancouver, Alex's kindergarten teacher, Sandy Wong, wrote, "We live in a broken world and we're all flawed individuals. Mistakes are made. I believe that Alex was failed on so many levels by so many flawed people. Primarily by his parents who failed to provide for his life-sustaining needs. Secondly, by the BC Ministry responsible for providing the best care for him when his parents did not. Thirdly, by the judge who made a difficult, yet, I believe, wrong decision to return Alex to his parents. Finally, by family members, friends, and neighbors who knew of and or witnessed Alex's illness and deterioration, and yet remained silent. I hope that Alex's tragic death will bring about necessary changes regarding follow-up and monitoring in serious cases of neglect when once apprehended children are returned to their parents. His life story of suffering and premature death demands that greater, more open sharing of information between provinces be implemented. The most vulnerable must be protected. I will never forget Alex's sweet face and the privilege it was to teach, support, and encourage him during his kindergarten year. He's free of his suffering now and resting in peace. In sadness, Sandy Wong, Cochrane, Alberta." Just like here in the United States, in Canada there's no national child welfare system. Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, and each runs its own child protection system, all of which are operated differently under a separate set of rules, policies, and procedures. There's no national requirement to share data among these agencies. Both in Canada and in the United States, and likely in other countries as well, families are free to move from place to place, crossing state, provincial, or territorial borders to avoid the scrutiny of anyone who might intervene to save the vulnerable children in their care. There is no national database dealing with child abuse or neglect of the medical variety or otherwise. If there was such a system, if each agency was required to enter information about at-risk children in such a database, if these children were flagged on a national level, they could be monitored no matter where their families moved. These children could receive follow-up visits and access continued care. If Canada had a national system like this, Alex Radita may still be alive. If the U.S. had such a system, just off the top of my head, we might never have lost Lauren McConnell, or Rayleigh Browning, or Max Schollenberger, or Samaya Downing, or Eduardo Passo. If South Africa had a system like this, Poppy Vandermerve may never have died. If Australia had one, Madeleine Rose Stokes may have survived her parents' abuse and neglect. The list could go on forever. I found one small bit of good news in a CBC report about Alex's case that said new protections went into effect in April of 2016 that may help prevent another death like Alex's. In a written statement, BC's Ministry of Children and Family Development said, Canada's provinces and territories recognized we needed to strengthen information-sharing provisions to better protect the safety of vulnerable children and families. The new protocol, the statement read, authorizes the sharing of confidential information without the person's consent where necessary to ensure the safety and well-being of a child or youth. It's not clear if the new protocol would apply in another case like Alex's, however, considering his case had already been closed by the time the family moved to Alberta. I want to take some time to remember Alex, who may always be best remembered as the emaciated boy in his birthday photos, but who was so much more than that. Tracy Brady, the adult daughter of Alex's now-deceased foster mother Vera Boyko, said, I remember him as a chubby little boy with a smile on his face. What I keep remembering is all the times with Alex and my daughter, who was a year younger than him. I remember them going trick-or-treating, as he had never gone out for Halloween. He wore the pumpkin costume, and he was so excited about the candy. We had to be careful what he could have and substitute most of it for something healthy. When he attended church with Vera, Tracy said, little old ladies loved him. Alex loved playing with the big tub of Lego Vera kept at her house, and he was artistic, spending plenty of time drawing with Tracy's daughter when the two weren't playing outside or swinging at the park. Alex's sister, who testified at her parents' trial, said of Alex, he was a very vibrant person. He was very artistic, smart. He was one of my mom's favorites. She said Alex liked purple ketchup and knew how to cook. He knew how to make eggs and such. She also said Alex liked playing Pokemon and cherished his Build-A-Bear teddy. If you're interested in hearing more about Alex's story, I highly recommend the episode of Crime Beat podcast hosted by Global News crime reporter Nancy Hixt called The Boy Who Fell Through the Cracks. The episode was really well done and contains interviews with investigators, social workers, and others who knew Alex and fought to save him. Whether or not Alex's death will lead to real change in Canadian child welfare policy, I have no way of knowing. One thing I do know with 100% certainty is that Alex will never be forgotten. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another case. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. You can also subscribe on YouTube by searching Suffer the Little Children Podcast. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes or become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive gifts. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLC Pod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook and Instagram. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildrenpod@gmail.com. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. If you see something, say something. Until next week, bye everyone.